So no surprise here, but I am a bit of a Bible nerd, and so I like to get a little bit into the weeds sometimes when it comes to digging below the surface of our English translations to understand how the Bible has made its way to us and how we translate it into language that we understand today. But as a pastor, I'm always trying to keep in mind the relationship between the study that undergirds the scriptures and how we understand them and how that relates to the ways that we make sense of them and the ways that we apply them to our lives. And sometimes you come across these really interesting intersections between the complexity of translating an ancient text into modern language and the way that that helps us to refocus on what these texts are for and how they can guide us today. I'm going to get a little technical here, but in our Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures, they are primarily translated from something called the Masoretic Texts. And these are Hebrew texts of the entire Old Testament that date to the 11th century CE, so right about 1,000 years ago. And for a very long time, those were the oldest Hebrew manuscripts that we had available to us. What we also have are much older Greek manuscripts of the Hebrew scriptures called the Septuagint. And that's not surprising because that Greek translation, that was the primary version of the Hebrew Bible that was in circulation at the time of Jesus. And so one of the complications in translating Bibles into English has always been deciding whether we should prefer the older Greek manuscripts that are already a translation, or whether we should look to the newer Hebrew manuscripts that are almost a millennia younger than what we have in Greek. Now, a lot of that debate was settled in the 20th century after the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered and examined, because those were actually very ancient Hebrew manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible in Hebrew. And for the most part, what they showed is that the Masoretic texts were incredibly consistent with what the Hebrew people were reading in Hebrew at the time of Jesus. It's actually pretty fascinating if you're a Bible nerd to think that it was only in the 1940s that we discovered some of the most important biblical texts in history. And it was literally a shepherd boy throwing rocks into caves that discovered them when he heard some pottery break. By the way, that's why I tell my kids not to throw rocks. You never know. But let's take a look at our text today, and I'll show you why I'm bringing all this up. This is 1 Samuel chapter 13, verse 1. Saul was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned over Israel for 42 years. Now, you may notice here that the words 30 and 40 are italicized on the screen. They probably will be in your English Bible as well. That's because those words don't exist anywhere in Hebrew. What the Hebrew actually says here is that Saul was a year old when he became king, and he reigned over Israel for 2 years. Now, that's obviously nonsense. So let's go to what the Greek says, and well, this entire sentence, verse 1, does not exist anywhere in the Septuagint. And it's very obvious this was a mistake. Saul was not a year old when he became king, and so it's very likely that the Septuagint translators came across this passage, realized, well, that doesn't make any sense, and rather than filling in the gaps, they just decided to leave it out of the Bible. Our English Bibles, though, take a different approach. And they just, well, bluntly fill in their best guess that seems reasonable to them here. The NIV says that Saul was 30 years old and he reigned for 42 years. The New American Standard Bible figures that Saul was 40 years old and he reigned for 32 years. The ESV says that Saul lived for 1 year and reigned for 2 more. And probably my favorite translation right now, the NRSV-UE, terrible name, good translation. It says that Saul was X years old and reigned for 2 years with a big old asterisk beside it. And part of the reason I like that is because if you are just reading through, they don't try to pull any sleight of hand here. They just let you know, hey, look, there's a problem in the text here and we had to figure out something. Now, does any of that matter for our story today? Absolutely not. But that is precisely why I want to talk about it. Because it highlights how complex and nuanced our relationship with the text is, and I think it helps to focus us on what the scriptures are for. See, the very fact that Jewish translators came across this passage some 2,000 years ago and saw what was an obvious mistake and just decided to leave it and move on, I think that tells us that the power of Scripture was never in the details to begin with. It was never about the perfect alignment of text or even an objective reading of historical data. No, the power was always about the story, in understanding the lesson and metabolizing the point. See, what Jewish translators knew was deciphering Saul's age didn't really matter all that much, but learning from his story did, so we might as well get on with that. And far too often, what I see is people arguing about the details while completely missing the point. Missing the forest for the trees, as it were, right? And if I were going to scale that lesson up, I might even go, this goes far beyond just what we read in the text into every aspect of our lives. If you find yourself constantly arguing about the minutiae of your theology and not becoming kinder and more generous as you do it, or if you find your theology constantly building more walls and excluding more people, rather than leading you to love more freely, then it's at least possible that you have begun to lose your way by staring a little too closely at the path that's beneath your feet. When the psalmist says that the Scriptures are a lamp unto my feet, he doesn't mean stare at the ground. He means let Scripture keep you moving forward. Hey, thanks for making it through to the end of that. If you're interested in what we're doing here at Commons, then give us a subscribe, a like, all of that stuff. And by all means, post a comment and we'll continue the discussion there. You can also join our Discord for the ongoing dialogue here in our community. Anyway, have a great week. We'll see you soon.